My name's Fitzpatrick. I work in the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and firstly, I suppose just to say thank you to the organisers for giving us the opportunity to have this session here today to talk about how to engage across sectors for biodiversity. Today, the format that we're going to use, I'm going to give a talk, maybe 15-20 minutes, just to set the scene a wee bit. Then Juanita, Browne, who's the project officer on the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, she will lead a panel discussion with our three panellists who we'll introduce in a wee bit. We want to have that kind of an informal, just their own experiences, what they've learned and what they can, add to this discussion. So we'll start, I'll just give a wee bit of background to the whole thing. I think we all know where we are at this stage. And I think it's true to say that biodiversity loss is a serious problem that isn't going to solve itself. And again, I'm parroting now what was said yesterday, but the more public support we have, the more political will there then is. And you'd have to ask the question, do the public care about this? And I think there's some things going on in the background in this. One is that biodiversity is very complex. It can be hard to communicate, in the busy modern world. And often we don't communicate it very well, frankly. And also, more worrying really, there's a new normal being created. And it's being created all the time, I think. Over the last 50 years, we've seen huge increases in mechanisation, intensification, urbanisation, commercialisation. But hidden within that progress, there can be downfalls. Yet, by the time you realise that, sometimes, generations have grown up with it as a norm. That could be the way that we treat people, it could be the way that we manage public services, or it could be the way that we manage the landscape. So when you then have to try and deal with that problem, you have to bring about a societal change, which is a much more complicated thing than to have to do. So do the public care? I think they do care a lot, but we're not engaging with them as well as we could, in my opinion. So, biodiversity conservation, it's a complicated thing. There's part of it, this just map of Waterford could be anywhere in the country. Part of it is protecting, threatened habitats and threatened species. That's a small portion of the land area. And often that's not something that the public particularly engage with. They might know what's happening, but they don't feel very connected to that sometimes. And then there's all the rest of the landscape. There's all the farmland, the public land, our gardens. So we do have to protect, obviously, threatened habitats and species. But you have to ask then, what about the rest of the landscape as well? How are we looking after that? I grew up in the 80s, and I was trying to think back of my memories of nature. And I've got loads, as I'm sure all of you do. So I've done to death, but, I remember for a good decade of my life, I was scared stiff to go outside the back door because the amount of moths that would flit around the light, at night. And there was a rat that used to come into our garden at some stages, and my dad, we wanted to get rid of it, so he put out his live trap, but every time he'd get up in the morning, there'd be hedgehog in it. And he'd have the trauma of trying to get this hedgehog out of the live trap. Or this plant, which for me, showing my age and all, is forever associated with May altars. I don't know if you ever had to collect plants for a May altar in your day, but I lived in a state of houses on the edge of a small town in County Derry, and you didn't have to go too far, to be honest, to go and collect flowers for May altar. If you had to do it now, you'd have to go quite a bit. The same thing, I'd say, the best 50p my mother ever spent was one of these. You're not only taking it to the beach, but also, you're collecting sticklebacks. We'd spend hours in the garden collecting butterflies. Again, I'm not sure so much fun these days for children because you have to wait a long time to see one. And, what I used to hate actually was the frogs jumping into your wellies. And I suppose for my own children, this is as close as they come to that, to be honest, which is sad. So I suppose back then, biodiversity was something that we interacted with. It was something active. And that's what we've lost, I think. So now, the landscape, the way we manage it, it's neat, it's tidy, it's sterile. We don't have those opportunities anymore to connect with biodiversity in that natural way. In the past, we connected with it whether we wanted to or not. That doesn't happen anymore, unfortunately. So we have to look at how we're managing that landscape and look at how we could be managing it and say, and really I think the challenge in 2019 is connecting people back with biodiversity and persuading them that it's important and something worth cherishing. And that's obviously a huge challenge. So we've been asked here today to talk about how we engage across sectors, how you design a programme that engages everyone, that encourages farmers, businesses, councils, policymakers, the public, schools, local communities, everyone to take part, and what it is that those groups need from us to feel motivated and to feel confident that they can take action. So what I want to do for the rest of this is to talk about 10 lessons that we've learned through the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. To be honest, you're learning every single day in the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, so I won't pretend for a second to be an expert, but these are just 10 things I think that we've learned so far from that process. The first thing is that you have to plan your message really carefully. It has to be clean and simple. And I think that going forward, we need to identify really simple vehicles that can be used to sell the biodiversity message to a wider audience, or to a very wide audience. What we're doing is using pollinators, obviously, for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're an element of biodiversity that people can understand and really relate to. You can communicate, particularly bees, as a very clean and simple message. You can monitor change easily, which often isn't the case actually with components of biodiversity, particularly if they're more complicated and more difficult to identify. And also protecting pollinator has knock-on benefits for biodiversity generally. We know that over 75% of our wild plants benefit from being pollinated by insects. Those wild plants form really the core of everything, food and shelter for most of nature, seeds for mammals and birds and so on. So really, protecting pollinators has huge added benefits for a whole range of biodiversity generally. Their plight is also very typical of many components. We've got 99 different bees in Ireland, the honeybee, 21 different types of bumblebees, and then 77 different types of solitary bees. And we know that of those wild pollinators, the bumblebees and the solitary bees, 1/3 are threatened with extinction. So real serious issues. And perhaps even more worrying from the All-Ireland Bumblebee Monitoring Scheme that's managed by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. We know that the abundance of our common bumblebees has declined by 14% since 2012. That is huge. So there's enormous issues to deal with. And I think in some ways pollinators are typical. It's a slight oversimplification. But our rarer species are disappearing through loss of the semi-natural habitats, and our common species are declining because of how we manage the rest of the landscape. The second lesson that we've learned is that you need to collectively agree a framework for the future. And I've underlined collectively there because it has to be something that's done together. With this one, it's an All-Ireland plan. We have a cross-sectoral steering group, representatives from both the north and the south. And we went through a fairly involved public consultation process before we ever published the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. We did go through a public process where everyone had the opportunity to feed into it. And I think that's really important, that you don't present people with something, you give them the opportunity to become a part of it and, to contribute to it and to buy into it. I do just want to make the point as well that the All-Ireland element of this is a very strong part of it, and it's been hugely beneficial to the project as a whole, because really we've been able to share knowledge across both jurisdictions. We've been able to share so much knowledge and expertise, and also to some degree resources. So the All-Ireland Plan was published. Jean Stout and I started this process. We almost started it a long time ago, actually, and we were sort of waiting for the time to be right, but we really kicked off in 2014, and then it was published through the steering group in 2015. And really, it's just agreeing a positive framework to address the problem. So at the time it was published, 68 governmental, non-governmental organisations agreed to support it, and it's identified 81 actions to try and make Ireland more pollinator friendly. So the steering group oversee the implementation, and that then is coordinated by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Really, it's totally a bottom-up approach. It was developed without funding, and obviously it's a voluntary plan. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but 81 actions, most of them are focused around the landscape, about how we can change the way that we manage it to make it a place where pollinators can survive and thrive again. So how can you make farmland more pollinator friendly? How can you make public land? How can you make private land? And then there's various other objectives, obviously, to support that core aim. The third thing that we've learned is that messaging should be positive, constructive, and I think celebrate the biodiversity that we have. We've got amazing biodiversity in Ireland. We've got amazing pollinators. We need to celebrate that. And, the messaging has to be positive. We are where we are. There's no point dwelling on that. I think we have to learn how we got there, but then we have to think about where we're going next. And I think you have to be positive, you have to be constructive, and you have to try to address this problem. And I think that's what the public responded to. So say, amazing pollinators, amazing people out there doing so much to help, and we have to celebrate that and communicate that, I think. And really, I suppose it is about connecting, and it's about caring, and it's about exploiting. That's already there. We just need to take advantage of it. The fourth thing, I think, is you have to be very clear in what you're asking people to do. So with the pollinator plan, we have, I suppose there's one core message. It's if you have some responsibility for a piece of land, right from the smallest window box to the largest farm, if you have responsibility for some piece of land, you can help. We can all help. We all have to do something if we want to solve the problem. But it's about food, shelter, and safety. So it's about thinking about your land, however big or small it is, and is it providing food, shelter, and safety for pollinators? So I suppose that's the core, simple message that we're trying to get out all the time. The fifth thing we've learned, I think, is that solutions have to be evidence-based. And they also have to be tailored to the audience that you're trying to target. So within the pollinator plan, we've been publishing evidence-based actions for different sectors. We've got one for schools, one for farmland, one for councils, one for local communities, one for businesses, one for gardens, one for faith communities at this stage. So they're all evidence-based actions. What's also been really something that we've deliberately tried to do is each time we look at the science and come up with the evidence-based actions, and then we consult with the sector. So we talk to a lot of people in that sector just to see what they think, if they're actually realistic and pragmatic, and also what kind of language we need to be using. So we try really hard each time to consult with the sector and then to tailor each guideline to that sector. So each of the guideline documents, has lots of different options for things that you can do. So whether it's the council one or the local community one, lots of different options of things you can do to help pollinators. And the idea with that, one local community is not like another in the same way that your garden's probably not like mine. So what we wanted to do was have a range of actions so everyone can do something. So there's something to suit everyone. And they're all, fairly pragmatic, low cost, and simple things that you can do. Got a separate how-to series that gives additional information on more complicated actions, and those were developed in partnership with relevant organizations. So, say these guideline documents, they talk about how to provide food, shelter, and safety. Just to say a wee tiny bit about some of them, I suppose, like with the council one, for example, it's a wee bit more formal maybe than some of them. Within that, identified people in the council who could help with particular actions, whether it was engineers or planners or horticultural staff or CEO or heritage officers and biodiversity officers. We also put cost-benefit analyses into that one because that was something that they were really interested in. How much does it cost to change your mowing regime, or how much does it cost to move away from one type of planting towards another? And again, in that one, the lists of pollinator-friendly plants are longer and more technical. With the local communities, which was the first one that we did, which was aimed at tidy towns specifically, to be honest. And again, what we felt was that there were tidy towns groups who wanted to do something for biodiversity, but just didn't know what to do, to be honest. So with that one, we just wanted to have clear actions for things that they could do, and just as much information as they might need then to go and do them. Again, the one for businesses, for example, is shorter than the others because that was the kind of feedback that we were getting from that sector. So it just outlines the core thing, and then they're happy to go and get additional information online and so on. With that one, we focused, on the benefits to businesses of taking part, how it would help from a corporate social responsibility perspective, how it would benefit staff, all those kind of things, how it would help your sustainability credentials with your consumers, that angle, I suppose. We also developed a framework for businesses, so a business can sign up to support the plan. They sign an agreement, and in doing that, they agree to take one action within the business in the first year and another 2 by 2020. They get a certificate, a logo, so it's slightly more, it's a more of a framework type approach with that particular one. And I think, I'm sure we still have lots to learn, but that tailored approach to each sector has been working really well. So at this stage, I think most councils have embraced the plan, and a lot are making changes to the management of public land. And that's a sector that we're seeing really increasing all the time. With local communities, in the last 3 years, 140 different local communities have become pollinator friendly and entered the Pollinator Award in the Tidy Towns competition. The Heritage and Biodiversity officers came up with this, so it's an award, a dedicated pollinator award within the Tidy Towns competition. And the heritage officers and biodiversity officers put together the pot of money that's used for the prize. It's been amazing. So there's 140 communities across the country that have taken a whole range of pollinator actions, I suppose enough that they feel they can enter an award, which really is fantastic, and enormous credit to both to the heritage officers and to all the Tidy Towns groups who've embraced that. And again, with businesses, there's 102 companies that have now signed up as supporters of the plan and that are taking actions to help, which is great. I think the sixth thing we've learned is that information has to be easily accessible, so free, ideally, and using appropriate channels. For us, the website is very important, obviously. We've also got various other ways that we communicate, videos and things like that. And again, with the videos, we try really hard that it's a peer-to-peer approach. There's no point me standing up and telling a farmer how to manage a hedgerow. That has to be done by a farmer. And that's what we do. And again, Pat here filmed a really lovely Tidy Towns video with us that was funded by Waterford County Council. Pat's not from Waterford, is there any confusion? Geashill won the Pollinator Award in Tidy Towns a couple of years ago. And again, Pat agreed to film, this little piece for us, and it's really lovely just explaining their journey through this and, what the challenge is and how it's all gone. And I would say that we don't tell these people what to say. You can vouch for me on this, Pat, but we let them say whatever they want. And I think that works much better because it's that peer-to-peer approach. The seventh thing I think that's really important when you're trying to engage across sectors of biodiversity is that you have to actively manage the process, and again, in an open and transparent way, obviously, ideally. Because I think it's really important that people feel they're part of something and that together you're making a difference. So I think if you're part of a plan, whatever kind of plan it is, and there's other people involved in it, you want to know what they're doing. You want to know that you're not the only one doing your bit. And you want to see what's happening with everyone else and learn from what's happening across all sectors. So we try hard to, it is actively managed. And, we've got various mechanisms that we try to use to show that it's an active thing, that it's something that you can actively engage with and that it's a learning process. The eighth thing, then, is I think we have to work together as much as possible. Sometimes we've not been that good at doing that in Ireland, but I think it's absolutely crucial. I suppose in our case, we rely, there's now over 90 partner organisations, for example, we rely a lot on them to communicate our message for us, to their own networks. And the whole premise of the Pollinator Plan is about coming together to create networks of pollinator-friendly habitat. So, for example, we have these guideline documents that we produced, and what we then try to do is use existing networks or frameworks to encourage the implementation and rollout of those. Both that's cost effective and also it helps to bed it down within existing structures. So for example, with schools, we've worked with green schools or eco schools in the north, with gardens, DIY, make sure you're up bloom, those kind of things. With businesses, Board BIA, business in the community, and so on. The ninth thing that we've learnt is that you have to track progress. And if I was to be critical of other biodiversity-related plans in Ireland, I think it's that we don't always track progress. We don't always check if what we're doing is working. And, I think you have to check if it's working. If you don't want to be held accountable, at least you have to learn from, what didn't work. So I think it's really, really important that you track progress. And, because the Pollinator Plan came from the bottom up, I'll say we didn't do it for the crack. We were trying to do something that was going to have a positive impact. So tracking progress has always been a hugely important part of it. And there's 3 ways that we do it. One is that there's 81 actions. Responsibility is shared out between all the partner organisations. Once a year, they have to report on progress. So once a year, they send us a really short update on what they've done against the action that they agreed to. And I should say they all agreed, there's no money involved in this, they all agreed to do these with their own funding. So once a year they send in that. The second way that we track progress is within the National Biodiversity Data Centre. We developed a special GIS-based mapping system that will track the creation of pollinator-friendly habitat. So if you're on your site, whatever it is, from your garden, to your church, to your farm, to your school, whatever it is, you can draw around your site and say what it is that you've done. So that shows the build-up of resources going back into the landscape again. And the third thing then, and obviously arguably the most important, is it will track changes in the pollinators themselves. This plan is only going to be a success if we see more healthy honeybees, if we see more bumblebees in the landscape, if we see more solitary bees. So, and again, obviously that's what we do within the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So those systems need to be in place. I would say they are in place for bumblebees really well at the minute. What we don't have in place, to be honest, is an effective system to track changes in the solitary bees or the hoverflies. And that is something, that needs to be addressed. I suppose just say a wee tiny bit about number one. So each year we ask the partners to tell us what they've done. And then we publish that report publicly on the website. So this, just before Christmas, was year 3. And, it's great. I suppose we were overwhelmed by the amount of support that the plan got. And then you worry, will people put their money where their mouth is and actually do what they've said they'll do? And unfortunately, they have. So at the end of year 3, 92% of those 81 actions are either completed as agreed or in train for this year. Just to really quickly show you, this is the online mapping system. It's called Actions for Pollinators at pollinators.biodiversityireland.ie. And really, the dots show locations around the country where people are on the ground taking action. It's only capturing a fraction actually of what's taking place out there at the minute, but it's just to show you there is a system there that can do that. So you can search by sector, you can search by the type of action, and again, then you can zoom in so that this happens to be Dunboyne. So like the red dots there are people in their garden who've taken action, the orange dot is a school, and the purple dot is the local Tidy Towns group. So the idea was that it helps people, it shows what's happening, it shows us something active, it helps people get recognition, and then it helps coordinate, hopefully, when people use it fully, it'll help coordinate things at local levels. The 10th thing I think that we've learned you'll be glad to know, is that you have to be open to learning and evolving and adapting. And again, I think you always have to be open to that, and sometimes there's a reluctance or it seems a bit of a weakness. And I think we have to move away from that, to be honest, because there's always something new to learn, and especially when you're engaging across sectors, there is so much to learn from other people. And you have to be willing to take that on board and to adapt and evolve. I suppose one thing for us at an iResearch Insights survey, so it's like a Red Sea poll, one of those came out over the summer completely independently of the plan. Actually, they just were aware that there was a public interest in bees and they wanted to test that. So they published that just in September, so they totally independently to us. We just saw the press release the same time as everyone else. But it showed various things that we've been able to use within the plan. But the one key thing was it showed that 88%, and they surveyed 1,000 people, it's a properly done poll across the Republic of Ireland, and 88% of the public want the government to do more to help. It just shows, it's hard to get 88% of people to agree to anything, to be honest. It just shows, and for me, what it shows, not necessarily about pollinators, it just shows how much interest, latent perhaps interest in biodiversity there is out there. And if we ever want to tap into this, the time is now. We can't sit around. The time is now. So, I suppose it's learning from that and saying, God, we have to do this now. Another, I suppose, just a really small example of thing we've learned, I have to say I did not know such things as pump houses existed. It was a farmer who we'd been engaging with contacted me, and he said that he was also responsible for pump houses in Tipperary, and he explained then it was part of the local water scheme. So he said, there's a National Federation of Group Water Schemes, and he thinks they'd be really interested. So as I then learned, and I'm kind of ashamed to say I didn't know this was out there because it's not something in the north, and I've been living in cities since, that there are pump houses within the rural landscape, thousands of them across the landscape. So when we approached the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, they were really interested. So we worked and, really quickly, I suppose, developed this guideline document, and they've agreed to promote it for us and send it out to all those people who have responsibility for managing those small sites. It's just a small example of, I suppose, of something that you don't see coming, but that you can take advantage of when it does. I've also learned the value of prizes. particularly through the Tidy Towns initiative. There's nothing that beats surprise, I've learnt. So, and we can talk more about that in the panel, but really, the Tidy Towns have just been amazing. In terms of their enthusiasm for the Pollinator Award, we've brought it into other things. We've been able to work with Antashka to have a Pollinator Award in the Green Flag for Parks scheme. And, we saw the success with Kieran Flood and the Irish Wildlife Trust Awards yesterday. So you can't beat an award, I've learnt. The other thing, I suppose, that I didn't really see was how people would really embrace this. I think when it's a clear message and they know what's being asked, people out there will embrace it and help spread the message for you. And we've found that, and there are so many local champions, or maybe listening to me all Canada yesterday, maybe local leaders is a better term for them, but people across all sectors, all walks of life, and some of them in the audience who've just totally embraced the plan. And I just want to say thank you, to be honest, to them all, because we couldn't do what we do without all those people out there who really embrace it and spread the message to so many other people and keep that enthusiasm and momentum going. Just to say a little bit about the funding, I guess. So the plan is currently supported by over 90 organisations. I coordinate it. I suppose I'm an ecologist in the National Biodiversity Data Centre, so I suppose about 2 days a week I look after this particular thing. You might know there's the other 39 staff we have then. So we wish. Within the Pollinator Plan, let's say 90 organisations. Unfortunately, 2 of them really stepped up to the plate once they saw the interest in this. So the Heritage Council agreed to fund a part-time project officer, which is Juanita, and Board B agreed to fund a part-time project officer, which is Gemma Hughes. So it is just me, part of my time, and then one project officer that does all this at the minute. But as I say, there's lots and lots of local champions out there who are helping us on the ground. The Department of Agriculture then, since 2016, have been giving us $15,000 annually, and that's what we use to develop the resources that you see, all those booklets, and it's what we use to be able to get out to key events and things. So, and again, thank you to them, because without that we wouldn't have been able to do this, but that is all the funding that we have for this initiative. That said, there's lots of other sort of independently funded things, print runs in particular, National Parks Wildlife Service, Northern Environment Agency, Department of Ag. And again, I just want to pay credit. There's lots of people who've independently funded things, and you could see it from the awards yesterday. So many people doing things for pollinators. But the Heritage and Biodiversity Officer Network have been particularly supportive. They've funded the Tidy Towns Award. They've helped us to fund lots of videos and animations, and thank you to them for that. And I know some of that funding has come through the Creative Ireland programme, which is a nice link that we've been able to use. We had a midterm review. You can see it on the website. It was published just last October. We wanted to kind of just honestly and transparently assess where we are with this at this stage. I'm not going to talk about it other than to say, I suppose, as the person who's overseeing most of it, there's an enormous frustration because there is so much interest out there. And really, we're just not capitalising on the current potential of this to affect real change. That's all there is to it. If I had to make a prediction, I'd say we're capitalising about a third of the potential, and that's a real wasted opportunity, particularly when we're here talking about what can we do. There's a lot more we can do with this alone, never mind all the other amazing things that we could take on board. So, and I think one thing is, which would help a lot, lots of things would help, but one thing would be just to have another full-time officer who could be dedicated to rural and community engagement. I was counting up before I came to this, just since Christmas, so the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've turned down 20 requests for, workshops and talks with local communities, with local authorities. I think that's a real wasted opportunity, to be honest. So I suppose, what have we learned so far? I think you have to plan your message really carefully. I think you have to collectively agree a realistic framework. I think you have to keep your message in positive, constructive, and again, just celebrate this amazing biodiversity that we do have. I think you have to be really clear what you're asking people to do. I think solutions have to be evidence-based and targeted. Information has to be easily accessible. I think you have to actively manage the process so everyone feels they're part of something active. To work together, you have to track progress. And again, you have to be open to, evolve and adapt and learning. you have to also just do it. You know, when you talked about this, Jean and I, people said, you're mad, there's no funding, there's no legislative framework. Sure, you know, we could still be waiting. Bumblebees already declined, 14% in the last 6 years. How long do you wait? So I think there's an element as well, you just do it. And sometimes when you do it, then it starts to happen. So, probably talked to Jean, 10 years ago, there was only her and a few others in her research group. This was the Irish Pollinator Research Network just last month. So that's expanded, or not solely because of the Pollinator Plan, but it's played a part. And also, we've been awarded funding from the Department of Agriculture for an EIP project to test a results-based system. It'll be based in Kildare. So we want to show how you can make all farmland more pollinator-friendly. So really excited about that. And I have to say full credit to the Department of Agriculture for the EIP programme. I think they've stuck their neck out, and I think it could be a real game changer for how we move forward with protecting biodiversity on farmland. Last slide, I promise. How can we engage better? I think we have to get behind the National Biodiversity Plan. I think that's a given. It was raised yesterday. We have to. Let's just implement it. Also, and it was mentioned this morning, I think we have to change the public narrative. Biodiversity is reported in a certain way. It's either what it's preventing you from doing as a farmer, as a developer. It's kind of unfairly compared to the devastation of, the loss of local services. It's all about the loss sometimes, which is really important. Or then it's, it's the skateboarding badgers and, surfing otters. So, I think there's certain ways it's reported, and we have to change that. We have to change that public narrative. I would say, what if Ireland didn't look like any other country in Western Europe? What if we all viewed our biodiversity as what sets us apart? It's good for biodiversity, good for services, good for our health and well-being, good for exports, good for tourism. And again, the more public support, the more political will there will be for the huge challenges that are ahead. So I am going to stop talking, and we'll move to the panel discussion. So I would just say that Slido is open, so if you want to feed into your ideas, you can feed in your questions. The whole point of this is to come together and I suppose to what's the best way to engage across sectors. Please, if you have thoughts, advice for us in general, it would be fantastic if you could share those. If you want to ask any specific questions of me or of the panel once they're finished, again, just put those up and we can address them at the end. But we're going to move to a panel now, so we're not going to do the stand up for 5 minutes kind of format. We want it to be a bit more informal, more of a chat. So Juanita is going to look after the panel, so I'll pass over to her. Thanks.
You did omit one thing, that if you really want a successful biodiversity plan, you need an UNA. So if you could just put that on your list, it would be very successful. I just want to start off with speaking to Pat. Una mentioned the amazing Tidy Towns groups that are working all over the country, and the Pollinator Plan just would be a publication without them. It really is these champions working at community level in a bottoms-up way. Would you like to tell us how Geashill, who won the Pollinator Award, the overall award in 2017, and then a regional award this year in 2018, how you got involved in Geashill? I know you were doing work for biodiversity beforehand, but what appealed to you about the Pollinator Plan?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of Geashill Tidy Towns. I suppose just to give a small bit of background, Geashill is a lovely little picturesque village, a village of just under 400 souls. It's built around a beautiful stone-walled green. We're very proud of it. And we've been involved in Tidy Towns now for, I suppose, 40 years or more. And at the end of each season, we have our annual review. And we were having our annual review back in 2013. Because I note officially the Pollinator Plan began in 2015, but we feel we were working on the Pollinator Plan for about 2 years before it was launched. And the reason that happened was we were looking at the progress we'd been making, and we were trying to find where we could improve. And one of the areas we identified was wildlife and natural amenity. And we felt that in areas like biodiversity, our knowledge was very patchy. We felt we could do an awful lot more. So Amanda Pedlow, our heritage officer, suggested to us that what we needed was a wildlife audit. And eventually that turned into a wildlife audit and a 5-year management plan, which was conducted by George Smith of Blackthorn Ecology. It was sponsored by Offaly County Council. And that plan delivered to us a very detailed report, a biodiversity inventory, which we had never come across before, and 5 years of hard labour from his action plan. So the first thing that George suggested to us was that we needed to plant trees. And the reason we needed to plant trees was because over the decades, we'd lost many old established trees. We'd lost them to old age, and we'd lost them to storm damage. And we hadn't been replacing them enough. So that was his suggestion, plant native trees. So we took him at his word, and we planned how we would go about it, and we set up a Trees for Families scheme to try and have as much local ownership of the idea as possible. We planted 150 trees in the Glebe Walk woodland, again, flowering native trees, and 300 more trees throughout the village. His second suggestion was hedgerows. We need native hedgerows. So we planted about 350 metres of hedgerows in that first year. So by the time the Pollinator Plan, the Pollinator Award, appeared on the Tidy Towns website in 2016, we were saying, well, what is this about? So we looked into it, and we discovered the Pollinator Plan 2015-2020, and we suddenly realized we knew absolutely nothing about pollinators, and that if we were to pursue this, we had an awful lot to learn. But the second thing we realized was that our planting of trees and our planting of hedgerows for the previous 2 years had given us a fantastic foundation to build on. So we felt that at least some of the heavy lifting had already been done. So in 2016, we decided we would give this a lash. But one of the areas we noticed in the Pollinator Plan was the emphasis on perennial planting. And again, we looked at one another, and there was very little knowledge around the table. So again, we went to Offaly County Council, and through the Heritage Office, we were able to enlist a wildlife horticulturalist, Lynn O'Keefe Laoghaire, who came to the village, devised the most amazing planting plans, and taught us how to propagate, how to divide, and how to sustainably grow our own perennial plants. Now, this is a little bit of a shock for Tidy Towns groups who are very wedded to the idea of annual bedding plants, begonias, petunias, they rule. So that was a challenge that had to be overcome. We got amazing support from the National School, from Geashill National School. We couldn't praise them enough. The children are just fantastic. The staff are very supportive. The principal, his default answer to every question, every request is yes. So with their help, with the help of the Wednesday Club in Geashill, with the help of our community employment scheme workers who do a tremendous amount of work, we gave it every effort we could. We began attending, we knew we didn't know enough about the bees, so we attended bee monitoring courses, bee identification courses. I attended one that Kieran of the Irish Wildlife Trust, and another, because I'm a slow learner, that was done by Tomás Murray of the data centre. So then we were able to set up our own walks within the village and conduct our own monitoring, and then upload that information onto the data centre. And then we fully understood what our inventory, our biodiversity inventory, was about. That it wasn't just a document that existed at a particular point in time, but that it was something living, and that it was our job to add to it.
Can I just ask
yeah.
you, Pat, what was the reaction? I know that, for instance, a lot of our actions are around reducing mowing and having longer grass so that wildfires can grow. What was the reaction locally? Like, whatever about your Tidy Towns committee deciding to take this on, with the local people, how did they react to longer grass and weeds or dandelions?
You could say there were little challenges.
I'd say.
For example, and I can understand residents who have been so proud of their blousy, beautiful displays and are hoping that someday the RTE cameras will arrive and say, where is the hanging basket? Because that's what you always see on the night the results come out. So there was a certain amount of resistance. I suppose there was a worry that we wouldn't perform as well, that we wouldn't be viewed as caring enough.
Yeah.
So we decided we'd just take it a step at a time. So we said, look, we'll just do one perennial bed, well, maybe two. The mowing, the unmown, again, people were concerned, it will look as if we don't care. But when people realize that it saves on labour, it saves on time, and the treasurer suddenly sees that the fuel bill has plummeted, then you start getting a little more support. So in every area like that, I think we felt that that there was support there if we explained what we were doing. If it was explained.
That's the feedback we get a lot of the time.
Yes, and we had the same with pesticides. We had a lovely incident when we were out doing our first perennial planting. I've told you this story before, where a local man and his dog came over to inspect the work that we were doing and looked at us planting our puny little perennials in this bed, and his dog took a look, cocked his leg, and peed all over the tray. And it was a very eloquent statement in terms of...
They weren't ready for the change to perennials.
And his master looked on approvingly and he said, well, it'll save you on Roundup.
Yeah.
So what he hadn't realised was that we'd actually stopped using Roundup in 2014 and we haven't sprayed anything ever since. And again, there was this fear that we were going to end up with the jungle encroaching.
Yeah.
But then last year, we were nominated by Tidy Towns for the Best Kept Village Award in Ireland, North and South. And we won the award.
That's
so
amazing.
The place can't be that unkempt.
That was such a good message for someone
Yeah,
who's
and I think it was very
a
important for us.
pollinator-friendly village, and yes, the tidiest is...
Yes.
Yeah. Anne, you're the biodiversity officer in Dunleary, Rathdown. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what Dunleary are doing in partnering with the Pollinator Plan?
Yeah, certainly. I suppose I'd like to just say firstly, most of our staff in Dunleary Rathdown are fantastic in terms of their interest in promoting the Pollinator Plan. So I'm representing them. So I'm only recently a member of the County Council, and some of the projects were there before I started. But one that we have begun when I arrived is something similar to Pat's in relation to our landscape management and how, as a county, so if you can imagine moving from a very small village to an entire county and trying to establish how we can change our landscape management to promote pollinators and also increase our wildlife corridors, especially in an urban county, because there are challenges in terms of the green space we have and the areas of, I suppose, natural areas that we have for wildlife. So it took a sitting down with our park staff who were very interested in developing a new way and a new approach to landscape management for pollinators. And we looked at all our areas that are green verges, road verges, areas within residential housing that have green areas that we control, and of course our parks. And so we've allocated certain areas to pollinators and to wildlife corridors. We've mapped them on GIS, and then we've spoken to our landscape contractors and explained to them how we would like to manage. So it's been a big change, but we're trying to do it, I suppose, ease the public into it gently. So last year we started 22 sites that we called our pilot sites for this change in management, reduced mowing, no spraying, and to see how these areas can develop for pollinators and for wildlife. So we've expanded it out to another 80 areas this year. So we'll see again in terms of feedback and the public participation. We've publicised it. We're sending out letters to the public, but generally we try to communicate digitally through our website and tweets.
What has the reaction been like?
Yeah, so like Pat was saying, we've had some mixed reactions. I've had some phone calls that have been very tetchy, so to speak, and you know, some I suppose, you know, people have this perception of how their manicured areas look, and they like that, and you know, they get anxious when they perceive sometimes that we are not managing their areas. And it's really important to explain that to people, that we are managing them. We're managing them differently. But in actual fact, because we don't cut as often, and because the areas are becoming naturally overgrown, so to speak, we do have to continually check them for litter and for any issues. So in terms of, you know, in terms of costs, it hasn't necessarily been a massive cost saving for us in that sense. You know, some people would suggest to us that we're trying to cut back on expensive ways of managing, but it actually isn't. So we found that overall it has been very positive, and people have been very, very happy. And in actual fact, I'll often get phone calls from people asking me, why hasn't their area you know, been allocated this type of management, which is great.
It's very encouraging. Yeah.
So.
And Carmel, you're from SSE Airtricity, and you've been doing amazing work in Lincoln with the Pollinator Plan. And again, it'd just be great to hear why it appealed as a business, from the business sector, why the plan appeals, and how accessible or not you found it to become involved with.
Yeah, I suppose for us, it's partly, we're talking about engagement here, so it's partly a way of telling our story. And that story, we need to tell it internally to our own staff members. There's about 20,000 people working in SSE across Scotland, UK in general, and Southern Ireland as well. And then we have a story that we're trying to tell outside to our customers, so it's a business, and that's what we're doing. But basically, we realised, myself and my colleague John O'Sullivan realised that largely we're doing an awful lot of what's already in the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan through the work that we do. So as wind farm operators, we're operating about 30 wind farms on the island of Ireland. There is a large land holding within that, and one of our objectives as a company, we have biodiversity objectives, and it is to maintain and create biodiversity on those sites. So as part of that, there is a restoration program following construction, but then there is a long-term habitat management program. So within that, we operate from, say, upland areas where there would be heather, heath, wet bog, down to more lowland areas where you would have intensive agriculture. So on those sites, we try and manage them as best we can and maintain them as best we can for pollinators as part of the overall management strategy. Part of that is it provides a sustainable land use in areas for agriculture. We've heard a lot of talk about agriculture in the course of this conference and how squeezed it is for biodiversity. So you have a tendency towards intensification on one hand and possibly abandonment and encroachment on the other hand. Farmers have to make a living, so they're kind of getting pushed one way or the other, but this is an alternative income source for them. And we're hoping to maybe engage more so with farmers and say, look, this little corner is good, leave your nettles there, all that. That's something that we can work on, but the basic engagement in the first place is a positive thing. We also have, one of the big things with SSE since its inception, Airtricity was the original company in Ireland, and it had, back in 2003, it started a community fund. And this has been a real success story, and SSE, when it took over Airtricity, it kept on the community fund. So over the course of those years, it's engaged about 2,000 community groups and schools, men's sheds, community gardens, tidy towns, a huge range of groups. Part of that was for energy efficiency, but there's only so many, insulation light fittings you can do across a community. It's generally within about 15k of a wind farm. So they extended that to environmental stuff. So really now we're hoping as well to be able to roll this out with the communities that we're working with. They're already aware of it. A lot of the schools we're working with, they're already involved in the Pollinator Plan. As I say, the tidy towns are totally on board. But there's more we can do within that as well. So we're hoping to tap in on that essentially. And the final thing I would say is the monitoring we do. There's a substantial amount of monitoring goes on in wind farm sites. And we have, top class consultants out there who are more than able to identify pollinators. And we've had, on some of our reports as well, they just put it in at the end, their own interest is to record butterflies, bumblebees, whatever's there. So I think that's something that we can contribute, and they're the kind of the three strands that we're hoping to. And of course, climate change. SSE are the biggest renewable energy producers on the island, and we are, across the island, I think we're hitting about 30% renewable electricity now. So we're the only one of our EU targets that there's any chance of us actually hitting by 2020. So we contribute that way. And while at the moment climate change, it contributes to biodiversity decline to some extent, that's only going to grow as the effects of climate change kick in. So we're hoping to contribute positively that way also.
So your experience of linking with the Pollinator Plan, you feel it's a natural fit for...
It's about telling the story about what we're already doing, but it's also helping us to actually extend our remit for biodiversity engagement with the public and in our own company.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, conscious of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It'd be great to be able to chat for longer. I suppose just go to questions. I know there's some questions that have come in on Slido, and then there's an opportunity for people to ask questions from the floor. I might just start from the floor if there's anyone who wants to make a comment or have a question. I think there's a microphone coming.
I work in the planning profession and ecology. Now, planning authorities, I worked in planning for about 35 years before I moved into my own business. And planning conditions for developments are great. I mean, we get planning conditions for roads, for water, for services, for tree preservation, for landscape conditions, for invasive species control. And I really think it's time, and I just like to address it to the panel, is it time that we get our landscape conditions have specific requirements in relation to pollinators?
Yes, that would be wonderful. And I know from your experience of planning, do you think...
in terms of planning, as a biodiversity officer, I have the partial role of looking at planning applications, which very few, well indeed we have very few biodiversity officers in Ireland.
I was just going to say, it would be an amazing...
Actually, sorry Anne, can I just, because this coming
Yeah.
up on Slido as well, it's saying about do all county councils have a biodiversity officer? And you might, I think it's a good time to say that.
So there are only 4 biodiversity officers in Ireland at the moment, and 2 of them are in the Dublin region. I suppose it's really important to have that asset within a county council, that somebody is there looking after the biodiversity side of things and is dedicated to that. It is very much a busy job, but it's really worthwhile to have that input into all aspects within the county council, be it the county council's work, as pointed out, that sometimes county councils can make mistakes as well. It's really important to have somebody there who can guide engineers, the road section, whichever section it be, that when they're doing works, but also in relation to input into planning. I see that as a really, really good opportunity to put in some conditions in relation to landscape, as Peter said, and biodiversity. And it is trying to encourage other county councils to have the same ethos as well.
I mean, that might be a good suggestion for your Seeds for Nature. If you're tweeting and using that hashtag, by a trained ecologist, a specialist, as Michael D said, in each county council as a biodiversity officer is a very basic starting point that, someone that we can liaise with. The heritage officers do wonderful work, but they're spread across so many responsibilities across all different types of heritage. A dedicated biodiversity officer would be amazing.
Juanita, if I could just add to that, I think one of the things that's come up in the conference is there are very good ideas, and then we hear, yes, we'd love to do that, but we don't have the staff. But just because we don't currently have the staff doesn't mean it's not a great idea. And so much of the success that I've witnessed over the last couple of days have been individuals, small communities, the incredible projects like the Burn Programme, the Bride Project, Abbey Leaks Bog. But this is all bottom up. And we do need to get a bit more top down.
I absolutely agree with you.
And so I would look at something like industrial estates, require every industrial estate to have a biodiversity area, to have a wildlife pond, require every school in the country, provide every school with wildlife areas. So in other words, this can be done if there's a will, but the bottom can't keep doing that. There has to be leadership from the top.
I would agree in terms of the Pollinator Plan, again, as a suggestion for your Seeds for Nature. I think so much has been achieved since 2015 from a bottom-up approach, but now is the time. It would be a real shame for it to disappear, and it's not actually that far-fetched to think that it could disappear and fade away. So I think it is time for project funding, government funding, a top-down approach to actually meet the potential that's there.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to go back to Slido. I want to say thank you to everyone for number 3 for all your support. There was one there before it, I was about to answer, and then that popped up. I was asking, are we not dealing with our engagement with transport authorities? And we are. To be honest, I suppose, because we're so overwhelmed in terms of human resources, we just have to prioritise things. So we are working with transport authorities at the minute, and there will be guidelines for roads, for rail, for greenways, and for trails, hopefully, eventually. So the road guidelines are nearing completion. They're being developed in collaboration with Transport Infrastructure Ireland. And then obviously we'll speak to colleagues in the north as well. So that one is in train. I think we're going to have to go to the one that is engaged people most about tidy towns. I'll make a really small comment on that myself. I think there has been an enormous change in tidy towns within the last 5-10 years. There's still a way to go, undoubtedly. We see, because obviously we get these entries coming in for the competition, there's a huge number of tidy towns groups that don't use pesticides anymore. Obviously there's more that do, and we need to look at that. But Pat, you might make a comment. Just, it says some tidy towns groups are destroying natural areas through spraying herbicides and managing amenity areas as monoculture parklands, and how can this change? I would argue, to be honest, that it is changing, and that you can only change at a certain rate.
I think it's changed dramatically in the last number of years. We would have more than annual meetings. We'd have several meetings a year with Offaly County Council where all of the tidy towns groups would be represented, where speakers are brought in to give us up-to-date current information on the sorts of things we might consider doing, and certainly the sorts of things that we should no longer be doing. So I'm surprised if it's still happening, and it's certainly we would have been guilty of that 5-6 years ago. But we've been informed, we know a bit better now. And I would imagine that most tidy towns groups around the country are moving, certainly if they haven't gotten completely there. And I know from your own websites, you don't say, let's stop all use of pesticides, because that's a very difficult thing to enforce, but you're saying limit. And I think people are doing their best at this stage.
No, I couldn't agree more from my own experiences as well. I'm going to go, I'm sorry, we've only got time for one more question. There's a lady there in red.
Hi, it's Marianne Harris, Dublin City Council. I just want to add clarification to what Anne has said. So we have 2 biodiversity officers in Dublin. You were saying Fingal and Dunleary. We also have one in Dublin City Council who works on my team, and I'm also working full-time on biodiversity. So, and then we also have another ecologist. So some local authorities, I think the urban ones, have a really good complement. but I think it's very uneven around the country, and I would certainly support the call for more of them.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. If one super quick question maybe, and then I'll just sum up. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom that you garnered with the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. My question just comes from the 10th lesson, where you said 88% of the public would like the government to provide more support, and that there's this huge latent support for the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan out there. So my question is this, following on from that, I'm wondering if recognition for food produce from the farms that you're working with the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan could be a game changer. You know, in the same way that the organic logo, the organic label, and the Made in Ireland label is used to market food produce, is that something that feasibly the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan could work with, perhaps with Bord Bia? And what do the panel think of that?
I suppose I'll just answer it really quickly. That is a journey that we're starting with that EIP project I mentioned. So we want to develop a whole farm scale pollinator scoring system so that there's some way to track whether or not a farm is pollinator friendly. That's what we would like to do from our side, and then obviously we'd hope that some of companies like Bord Bia might see the potential for that. So thanks, Robert. I'm just going to say, I wanted to sum up, I suppose. First, we've asked what are the things that we'd like or the ideas that we'd like to come out of this session. I'm obviously totally biased. I'd like some more funding for the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. I also think there's scope to use that model for other things, and I'd love there to be some conversation around that. Again, as said on one of my slides, I do think we need to communicate better with the public on biodiversity generally, and I hope that's going to be one of the seeds that comes out today. And then it would be great to see more biodiversity officers, in local authorities around the country. So I hope, and again, feel free to continue to provide your thoughts and advice. We might just have a quick look at the poll. Oh yeah, brilliant. And I couldn't agree more. It's grassroots, it's the community level that we have to engage at, so I'm delighted that that's popping up, giant letters there. So again, just say thank you so much for coming to this session. Thank you to Carmel and Pat and Anne and Juanita for the panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.